Graveyards, places of rest for the dead, and unease for the living. But across the United Kingdom, some burial grounds are anything but peaceful. From shadowy figures drifting between headstones to graves that seem to breathe with secrets, these sites are home to more than just bones and memories. Tonight, we're digging up the dark history and terrifying hauntings of the most haunted graveyards in the UK. Places where the veil between the living and the dead wears dangerously thin. Greyfriars Kirkyard, Edinburgh. Nestled in the heart of Edinburgh's Old Town stands Greyfriars Kirkyard, a cemetery so notoriously haunted that it has earned the reputation as possibly the most actively paranormal burial ground in all of Britain. Established in 1562, Greyfriars has served as the final resting place for nearly 5 centuries of Edinburgh's citizens. The kirkyard takes its name from the Franciscan friary that once stood near this site, whose monks wore grey robes, the Greyfriars. The kirkyard began as a simple burial ground for the growing population of Edinburgh's Old Town, but its location would prove significant, built on what locals believed to be cursed ground, where plague victims had been hastily buried in mass graves during the devastating outbreaks of the 1500s. In 1638, Greyfriars Kirk became the site where Scotland's national covenant was signed, a document that would lead to decades of religious warfare and bloodshed. The very stones of this place seemed destined to absorb centuries of human suffering. But the darkest chapter in Greyfriars' history began in 1679. Following the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, over 1,200 Presbyterian Covenanters, religious rebels who opposed the king's authority over the Scottish Church, were imprisoned in the southern section of the kirkyard. What happened next was nothing short of torture. These people were held in the open air through one of Scotland's harshest winters, with no shelter except crumbling tomb walls. They received barely any food or water. Many were chained to prevent escape. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded prison. Over the 5 months of imprisonment, hundreds died from starvation, exposure, and disease. Others were executed. Some were transported to American colonies as slaves, a journey many didn't survive. The survivors spoke of watching their fellow prisoners freeze to death while chained to tombstones, their bodies left to rot among the living for days. The man responsible for this atrocity was Sir George Mackenzie, the king's advocate. Known as Bloody Mackenzie, he prosecuted the Covenanters with such cruelty that his very name became synonymous with persecution and death. When Mackenzie died in 1691, he was ironically buried just yards from his victims in this imposing black mausoleum that still dominates the kirkyard today. For over 300 years, Mackenzie's tomb remained undisturbed, but in December 1999, everything changed. A homeless man seeking shelter from Edinburgh's bitter winter broke into the mausoleum through a hole in its roof. What happened next remains unclear, but witnesses say the man emerged from the tomb screaming in absolute terror, covered in scratches and cuts he couldn't explain. Some say he found Mackenzie's coffin and opened it, disturbing whatever malevolent presence lay within. Others believe he performed some kind of ritual, intentionally or otherwise awakening something that had been waiting centuries for revenge. What is certain is that from that night forward, the Mackenzie poltergeist began its reign of terror. And unlike typical ghost stories, this entity's attacks are not just reported, they're documented, photographed, and witnessed by hundreds of people. Since 1999, over 500 people have collapsed in the presence of the Mackenzie poltergeist. But fainting is just the beginning of this entity's repertoire of violence. In 2001, A waiver was introduced by City of the Dead tours. It was created in direct response to the mounting number of genuine physical injuries and medical incidents occurring during their tours. This is believed to be the only paranormal tour in the world that requires visitors to sign a legal waiver, specifically acknowledging the risk of supernatural attack. Most haunted location waivers cover typical tourist risks like uneven ground or low lighting. But Greyfriars' waiver explicitly mentions potential harm from paranormal entities. Scratches, bite marks, and burns that scar permanently are just some of the injuries tourists have endured over the years. The attacks follow disturbing patterns. Visitors report invisible hands grabbing their throats with enough force to leave finger-shaped bruises. Others find long scratches carved into their backs, scratches that appear through multiple layers of clothing without any rips to the fabric. But perhaps most terrifying are the bite marks. Dozens of visitors have emerged from encounters with the poltergeist, bearing what appear to be human bite marks on their hands, arms, and even faces. Forensic analysis of these marks suggests they were made by someone with 17th century dental characteristics, including gaps where teeth would have been lost to disease and malnutrition. One report from a tourist was particularly disturbing. He said, quote, "I felt something grab my wrist and pull me toward Mackenzie's tomb. The grip was so tight I couldn't break free. Then I felt what can only be described as teeth sinking into my forearm. When I looked down, blood was soaking through my jacket. The bite marks are still there 3 years later. They've never faded." Spirits in the kirkyard also seem particularly hostile to electronic equipment. Cameras drain of battery power within minutes of entering the Covenanters' prison. Equipment worth thousands of pounds has been destroyed. Cameras cracking for no reason, recording devices catching fire, and phones completely wiping their memory. When equipment does function, it captures disturbing anomalies. Photographs reveal shadow figures that weren't visible to the naked eye, faces appearing in reflective surfaces where no one was standing, and temperature readings showing impossible cold spots, some dropping to below freezing even on hot summer days. Audio recordings have captured what experts describe as the most chilling evidence yet. Voices, speaking in 17th century Scots, describing in graphic detail the torture and execution of the Covenanters. Most disturbing of all, these voices sometimes call visitors by name, names they couldn't possibly know. Beyond physical attacks, the Mackenzie poltergeist appears capable of temporary possession. At least 12 documented cases exist of visitors suddenly speaking in languages they don't know, recounting historical events they've never studied, or displaying knowledge of the kirkyard's layout that includes areas sealed off for decades. One of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of Greyfriars is what researchers call the Watcher phenomenon. Visitors consistently report feeling observed by hostile, invisible eyes, a sensation so intense it causes panic attacks and flee responses. Security footage has captured visitors suddenly running from empty areas of the cemetery, their faces showing expressions of pure terror despite being alone. When questioned later, they all describe the same experience: the overwhelming certainty that something malevolent was stalking them, just out of sight. Visitors also report hearing children singing nursery rhymes that end with descriptions of their own deaths. Some witnesses have been approached by phantom children who offer to show them where the bodies are buried, before leading them to unmarked mass graves that official records don't acknowledge. Recent reports include visitors finding their own names carved into tombstones overnight, phantom figures appearing in family photographs taken at the site, and most disturbing of all, people receiving phone calls from numbers that trace back to the Kirkyard, with voices speaking in Scots Gaelic, describing their inevitable death. Whether you believe in ghosts, poltergeists, or supernatural phenomena, the documented evidence at Greyfriars is undeniable. Hundreds of witnesses, physical injuries, electronic evidence, and ongoing encounters create a body of proof that challenges our understanding of life, death, and what might exist beyond. Nunhead Cemetery, London. Hidden in the shadows of South London lies a forgotten Victorian necropolis where nature has reclaimed the dead and something far more sinister has made its home among the ruins. This is Nunhead Cemetery, a place where witnesses have encountered horrors so disturbing that many refuse to speak of what they've seen. Nunhead Cemetery opened in 1840 as one of London's magnificent 7 Victorian cemeteries, designed to serve the rapidly expanding population of South London. Spanning 52 acres on Nunhead Hill, it was intended to be a garden cemetery, a place of beauty and peaceful reflection for the bereaved. The cemetery was laid out with grand Gothic revival architecture, featuring ornate chapels, elaborate mausoleums, and tree-lined avenues. At its peak, Nunhead was considered one of London's most prestigious burial grounds, attracting wealthy families who constructed increasingly elaborate monuments to house their dead. But by the 1960s, Nunhead's fortunes had dramatically reversed. Changing burial practices, declining revenues, and lack of maintenance led to spectacular neglect. The cemetery was essentially abandoned, left to the mercy of vandals, weather, and an explosion of unchecked vegetation growth. What happened next transformed Nunhead from a peaceful resting place into something resembling a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Ancient trees crashed through mausoleums, exposing coffins to the elements. Vandals smashed monuments and scattered human remains. Nature reclaimed pathways, creating a maze-like wilderness where visitors regularly become lost for hours. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the boundary between the living and dead began to blur. Exposed coffins, scattered bones, and the violation of thousands of graves created what many believe to be a spiritual disturbance of unprecedented magnitude. The first documented paranormal activity at Nunhead began in the early 1970s, coinciding with the cemetery's worst period of abandonment. But unlike typical ghost sightings, Nunhead became infested with what witnesses describe as shadow people, entities that seem to exist in the spaces between light and darkness. These aren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They're something else entirely. Witnesses describe humanoid shadows that move independently of any light source, watching visitors with an intelligence that feels ancient and malevolent. Unlike fleeting glimpses of typical shadow figures, the entities at Nunhead are aggressive and interactive. They follow visitors, block pathways, and most disturbing of all, they seem to communicate through whispers that bypass the ears and speak directly into victims' minds. In the most neglected section of Nunhead, vandalism and natural decay have created what locals call the Bone Garden, an area where human skeletal remains lie scattered among the undergrowth, exposed to the elements for decades. But visitors to this section report phenomena that go beyond the simply macabre. Multiple witnesses describe the bones rearranging themselves into deliberate patterns, symbols and shapes that weren't there moments before. Some claim to have photographed femurs and ribs forming geometric patterns, only to return and find them in completely different arrangements. One visitor to Nunhead described his experience as saying, quote, I've explored abandoned places for 20 years, but the bone garden broke me. I watched a skull roll across the ground with no wind, no vibration, nothing to move it. Then I heard children laughing, but it was coming from inside the skull. I ran and I've never been back. Several of Nunhead's larger mausoleums have also become focal points for some of the most terrifying paranormal activity documented anywhere in Britain. These family tombs, many with their roofs collapsed and walls crumbling, have become echo chambers for sounds that shouldn't exist. Audio recordings from inside these structures have captured what can only be described as screaming. Not the cries of the living, but sounds that seem to come from vocal cords that have long since decayed. The screams are often accompanied by the sound of frantic scratching against stone, as if something is trying to claw its way out from within sealed coffins. Hundreds of hours of audio recording from the mausoleums have been analyzed. The frequency patterns suggest they're produced by human vocal anatomy, but the resonance indicates they're coming from spaces that should be empty. It's as if the sound of dying is somehow preserved in the stone itself. Physical evidence supports these audio phenomena. Fresh scratch marks regularly appear on the interior walls of sealed tombs, marks that could only be made from the inside by something with human fingernails desperately trying to escape. Perhaps the most spine-chilling phenomenon at Nunhead occurs precisely at midnight, on nights when fog rolls across the cemetery. Witnesses positioned outside the perimeter gates report seeing what appears to be a Victorian funeral procession moving slowly through the overgrown pathways. The procession consists of dozens of figures in period mourning dress, carrying what appears to be an ornate coffin. But as witnesses watch longer, disturbing details become apparent. The mourners have no faces beneath their veils and top hats, and the coffin they carry is empty, its lid hanging open to reveal nothing but darkness inside. One of Nunhead's most recently documented phenomena is what researchers have termed the screaming earth. In several locations throughout the cemetery, visitors report hearing muffled screaming and pounding sounds coming from beneath the ground. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that these sounds correspond to locations where burial chambers have collapsed, potentially trapping coffins in underground cavities. But the sounds suggest something impossible: that the occupants of these collapsed graves are somehow still aware of their entrapment. Another of Nunhead's reported phenomena is that of the Collector, an entity that appears to steal personal items from visitors and redistribute them throughout the cemetery in impossible locations. Visitors regularly report items vanishing from their person while in the cemetery: watches, rings, phones, even entire pieces of clothing. These items later turn up inside sealed mausoleums, buried in graves, or hanging from tree branches 40 feet above the ground. Nunhead Cemetery stands as testament to what happens when the boundary between life and death is violated on a massive scale. Here, decades of abandonment, desecration, and neglect have created a supernatural ecosystem unlike anywhere else in Britain. Highgate Cemetery, London. Highgate Cemetery opened in 1839. What started as an elegant Victorian garden of death quickly became something far more sinister. The cemetery was designed by architect Stephen Geary and landscape gardener David Ramsay, who created winding paths through 37 acres of what was once ancient woodland. The Victorians spared no expense. Elaborate Gothic Revival architecture, Egyptian-style catacombs, and ornate mausoleums that cost more than most people's homes. But here's where things get disturbing. The cemetery was built on land that had been associated with dark occultism for centuries. Local records from the 1600s mention strange rituals performed in these very woods, and several accused witches were reportedly buried in unmarked graves somewhere on the grounds. By the 1860s, Highgate Cemetery had become London's most fashionable final resting place. The wealthy and famous flocked here, including Karl Marx, whose massive tomb still draws visitors today. But the cemetery's golden age was short-lived. The company managing Highgate went bankrupt in the 1960s, and the cemetery fell into devastating neglect. Nature began reclaiming the elaborate Victorian monuments, ivy-strangled marble angels, tree roots cracked open tombs, and worst of all, graves began to open on their own. This abandonment created the perfect storm for paranormal activity. Overgrown, neglected, and filled with disturbed graves, Highgate became a magnet for something ancient and malevolent. Highgate Cemetery earned its reputation as one of Britain's most haunted graveyards. What happens here goes far beyond typical ghost sightings. We're dealing with encounters that have left investigators permanently scarred. In the late 1960s, multiple witnesses reported seeing a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes known as the Highgate Vampire, stalking the cemetery paths at night. But this wasn't just another ghost story. This entity was described as having an overwhelming presence of pure evil, a darkness so intense that grown men would flee in terror. David Farrant, a local researcher, was the first to publicly document his encounter in 1969. He described feeling an oppressive, choking sensation before seeing a grey figure over 7 feet tall gliding between the tombs. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Farrant reported that the entity seemed to feed off fear itself, growing larger and more solid the more terrified witnesses became. The most haunted section of Highgate is the Circle of Lebanon, a ring of catacombs built around an ancient cedar tree. This is where the most horrifying encounters occur. Visitors report hearing children crying from inside sealed tombs, despite no children being buried there. Security guards have documented doors to the catacombs swinging open on windless nights, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness inside. But the most disturbing reports come from those brave enough to enter the circle after dark. Multiple witnesses describe feeling invisible hands grabbing at their clothes and hair, whispered threats in languages they don't recognize, and the overwhelming sensation of being surrounded by hostile presences. One security guard quit after reporting that he watched dozens of shadow figures emerge from the tombs simultaneously, moving in perfect synchronization like some kind of unholy army. Several psychic investigators have reported encountering something they describe as a feeding presence near the terrace catacombs. This entity apparently drains life force from the living, leaving victims aged and weakened. One investigator claimed to have watched her partner's hair turn completely gray in minutes after he approached a specific tomb. He aged 10 years in appearance and died of a heart attack 3 weeks later, despite being a healthy 35-year-old. Another entity at Highgate that has had multiple reports is that of a female apparition that has been seen kneeling at graves while sobbing uncontrollably. But when approached, her crying transforms into maniacal laughter. Witnesses report that her face appears to be rotting away as she laughs, revealing bone and empty eye sockets. Several people have claimed this entity follows them home, appearing in their mirrors and windows for weeks after their cemetery visit. Former cemetery workers at Highgate have given interviews describing tools moving on their own, freshly filled graves being found disturbed the next morning, and the sensation of being constantly watched while working alone. One groundskeeper quit after reporting that he repeatedly heard his name being called from inside sealed tombs. During the cemetery's restoration in the 1980s to 90s, workers reported finding coffins that had been opened from the inside, with scratch marks on the interior wood. These findings were documented by the Restoration Committee, though explanations varied from natural decomposition processes to grave robbing. Perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from photographer Malcolm Haynes, who spent months documenting the cemetery in the 1970s. His photographs began showing figures that weren't visible to the naked eye. Dark shapes moving between the tombs, faces in windows of sealed mausoleums, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be corpses walking upright through the cemetery grounds. Haynes reported that his camera equipment would malfunction specifically when pointing towards certain graves, and his developed photos often showed additional figures that no one remembered seeing during the shoot. Highgate Cemetery stands as proof that some places are too steeped in darkness to ever find peace. The combination of disturbed graves, occult history, and decades of neglect created something that defies explanation. A place where the boundary between our world and something far more sinister seems to have woven together. Glasgow Necropolis, Scotland. The Glasgow Necropolis was established in 1833, designed as a garden cemetery inspired by the famous Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Built on a hill called Fir Park, overlooking Glasgow Cathedral, it was created by the Merchants' House of Glasgow as a response to the city's overcrowded and unsanitary burial grounds. The cemetery spans 37 acres and contains approximately 50,000 graves, though only about 3,500 monuments remain visible today. The necropolis was designed to be a place where all social classes could be buried together, though the wealthy merchants and industrialists claimed the prime hilltop locations with their elaborate Victorian monuments. To enter the necropolis, you cross a sandstone bridge known as the Bridge of Sighs, named after the bridge in Venice, used to transport the dead. Multiple eyewitnesses have described seeing a tall, gaunt figure standing motionless at the far end of the bridge. Dressed in black, wearing a top hat, his face is obscured in shadow. Some say he fades when approached. Others say he vanishes only when you're halfway across, leaving you alone with a chill that settles into your bones. Locals refer to him as the Watcher. Paranormal teams report camera malfunctions and drained batteries whenever they try to film this exact area. Some believe he is the spirit of the cemetery's original caretaker. Others believe he never lived at all. Few know that beneath the necropolis lies a network of sealed tunnels and crypts, some dating back nearly 200 years. These areas are inaccessible to the public, officially. In 2004, a group of amateur urban explorers accessed a long-forgotten passage. What they found was far from peaceful: a decaying corridor filled with rotten coffins, human bones scattered unnaturally, and one sarcophagus pried open from the inside. Their torches reportedly flickered violently as they heard whispering, but no one else was there. The group fled, and one member claimed to wake up for weeks afterward with dirt under his fingernails, even though he never remembered touching the ground. At the northern edge of the graveyard stands a lesser-known statue, a weeping angel, partially eroded by time. But some say this statue does more than mourn. A former groundskeeper told a now-deleted blog in 2012 that he once saw wet streaks on the statue's face on a clear day, as if it had cried. Days later, he claimed his wife had a dream of the statue standing over their bed, its eyes open and bleeding. Others have claimed that when the fog rolls in, the statue can be seen turning to face people who pass by. And one rumor, repeated by ghost tour guides, suggests that if you photograph the statue on Halloween night, it won't appear in your photo. One of the most horrifying stories comes from a mother who visited the cemetery in 1999 with her young son. While she wandered toward one of the larger tombs, her son froze beside a small, sunken grave. He whispered, quote, "He's cold and he wants to come out." When she asked who, the boy simply said, "The boy in the box, he's knocking." Later, when she returned alone out of curiosity, she stood in front of the same grave and heard a faint, rhythmic tapping from beneath the stone. It was never explained. But according to burial records, the grave belonged to a 6-year-old child who died of unknown causes in 1864. Grave diggers and nighttime maintenance staff have reported an inexplicable phenomenon, entire grave markers disappearing, then reappearing in a different location days later. This isn't a trick of memory. In at least one instance in 1987, a plot marked for restoration was documented on a map, but when staff returned the next day, the grave was gone, replaced with wild grass, as if it had never been disturbed. 2 weeks later, the headstone reappeared over 30 meters away, sunken and cracked, with no signs of it being moved manually. Some speculate this is due to shifting soil. Others believe the graves move themselves. One of the creepiest recurring stories from the necropolis is that of the whispering children. In certain areas, especially around smaller broken gravestones, visitors have reported the unmistakable sound of children whispering or giggling. But when approached, there's no one there. Some have followed the voices, only to become disoriented and find themselves back where they started, even after walking in one direction for 10 minutes. One teenage girl claimed to hear a little boy say, quote, "You can lie down here with us if you want." A psychic medium later visited the same spot and described the energy as residual but hungry, as though something was mimicking children to draw people in. As in other haunted graveyards, there have been multiple reports of a phantom funeral procession at dusk. A group of pallbearers, dressed in old-fashioned Victorian mourning attire, are seen carrying a coffin. Their faces are pale, and their movements too synchronized to be human. Here's the terrifying part. Witnesses claim that when they make eye contact with any of the figures, they stop, lower the coffin, and turn to face the observer. One man reportedly suffered a stroke the following day after such an encounter. His final words, according to his wife, were, "They were carrying me." An unusually disturbing type of haunting reported by those who visit the necropolis involves dreams that persist for weeks afterward. These dreams typically feature recurring symbols: blackened angels, grave soil falling from the ceiling, and a door that keeps appearing at the end of a corridor but can never be reached. Some claim they've heard voices in their dreams calling them by name, even though they visited the graveyard anonymously. There are chilling reports of visitors returning to the cemetery in their sleep, over and over, being drawn to a grave they don't remember seeing. One woman claimed that during one of these dreams, she dug up a grave and saw her own corpse inside. The Glasgow Necropolis isn't just a cemetery, it's a city of the dead, a place where stone angels mourn, shadows walk without bodies, and the line between dream and nightmare begins to blur. Some visit for the history, others for the view, but a few, the unlucky few, leave with something they can't explain and never truly leave it. behind. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into the paranormal, please consider liking and subscribing. Hope to see you in the next episode.